Good afternoon. I'm Karen Kill. I'm the administrator with Browns Creek Watershed District, and this presentation is being recorded. It is going to be about Masterman and Woodpile Lakes within Browns Creek Watershed District. We have a few folks here today that are going to be sharing some information with us. We have Pat Conrad, who's going to give us a brief overview, as well as Ann Wilkinson is going to be running through some lake data information and trend information. And they are both from Emmons and Olivier Resources, limnology, background lake ecology. And we also have Ryan Fleming here, also from Emmons and Olivier Resources, who is going to be talking about flood risk and some of the analysis that we've done in recent years for looking at changing climate and whether or not there are any particular higher risks for flooding and what you may do to empower yourself to manage that risk, as well as Brett Stoppelstad from the Washington Conservation District, who will be here to talk about some things that residents can do on their own property, and we'll share some links of even how you can sign up for a free site visit, get some ideas about some things you can do on your property. We also have Hannah Peterson here today, who is Browns Creek Watershed District Watershed Assistant. Probably saw your mailing came from Hannah, and will probably be helping me up with a lot of the follow-up from this meeting as well. So with that, thank you all very much. We're going to keep this to 1 hour, and we'll leave some time at the end of that hour, before the end of that hour, for some specific questions and answers as well. So with that, Pat, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, Pat Conrad, Emmons and Olivier Resources. The district has gone through the district primarily manages the Browns Creek, but there are several lakes within the watershed district that they are responsible for managing as well. Over the years, we've done lake management plans on all of those lakes, including Masterman and Woodpile that we'll talk about today. So those plans would have been done in the 2000s, 2010-ish kind of range at that point. And what those lake management plans entailed was, conducting a bunch of research on the lake, looking at its water quality, its plant community, kind of getting a sense and a feel for the character of the lake. And then we also did a series of meetings with those residents at the time, basically to say, hey, here's what's going on with your lake. Here are things that you can do to help improve your lake, kind of educate the lake shore owners, if you will, and other residents on, all things lakes. From that, we developed a plan basically to manage essentially manage the character and the quality of those lakes moving into the future. So the idea today is that it's been quite a while since we've done this kind of outreach to the lakeshore owners, and felt it was probably time to re-examine the lakes, see what kind of trends we can glean, see if our management activities are being successful. Basically just update some of the assessment work, and then reach out to the landowners again and say, hey, here's the latest and greatest about the lake. So that is kind of an overview introduction, and from there I'm going to turn it over to Ann. Ann is a limnologist, which is maybe a word that not everyone is familiar with, but that is a person who studies and understands all things lakes. There's probably a better definition of it, but that's mine. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ann.
Thanks, Pat and Karen. Today, the presentation is going to look like an introduction to lake science as it pertains to both Woodpile and Masterman, and then give a water quality update on both of those lakes. And as Pat said, kind of a progress report since the last time we did this outreach. Then we'll talk about flood risk and BMPs and how you can be involved in protecting your lakes. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how the watersheds affect lakes. So watershed is all the land that contributes water to a given downstream water body. In this case, we're talking about our lakes, our Woodpile and Masterman lakes. Watersheds have different characteristics that couple kind of with what is going on with the land, that affects the quantity and quality of the water that is draining off and contributing to these lakes. Those characteristics can include size and shape, topography, the types of soils that are on the land. So if they're more able to absorb the rain that has fallen on them, or if they're just kind of not able to absorb that and create more runoff to downstream quicker over the landscape. Vegetation cover makes a big difference with that. So more shallow rooted plants versus deep rooted plants can affect how the fate and transport of pollutants downstream, and then land uses. So how people are using the land, or if people have changed the land over time, and how that contributes to how the lake functions. And then the main topic of the conversation when we talk about lakes, especially in Minnesota, is about nutrients. Nutrients are what kind of the food that all living things within the lake ecosystem live off of. Nutrients can come into the lake by two different pathways, either external loading, so that's that loading off of the landscape from runoff or through tributaries. And then there's internal loading, which is phosphorus and nutrients attached to sediment can be re-released and kind of introduced back into the water column and become available for the next thing that I'm going to talk about, which is algae. Algae are microscopic photosynthetic organisms that live in freshwater ecosystems, and they kind of inhabit the base of the food chain, and they take advantage of those nutrients as they're coming in. Another thing that lives in the water column that takes advantage of the nutrients is plants. So aquatic plants take up nutrients and utilize them for their growth. A couple other interesting phenomena that happen within the lake in terms of nutrients are a process called nitrification, in which nitrogen is converted from a soluble form into a gaseous form and released into the atmosphere. And then mineralization, which is those nutrients are mineralized and become sediments and settle into the bottom of the lake. And this all kind of creates a cycle of this lake ecosystem. And if all of those things are in check, we have a nice, healthy, functioning, diverse ecosystem. But when we see kind of imbalances of excess nutrients or excess algae growth, that's when we start to have kind of these problems and unhealthy systems. One of the ways that we could kind of track that is through phytoplankton or algae, and this is what I was talking about. They do need those macronutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, to grow. However, so phosphorus and nitrogen are kind of the macronutrients that all life needs to grow and thrive. However, in aquatic freshwater ecosystems, phosphorus is typically the limiting nutrient, meaning that phosphorus is kind of driving how much growth that there is, because there's usually enough nitrogen to go around. As I said, algae provide the base of the food chain, so they provide the food for the zooplankton, which in turn are food for fish. So they're very important part of the lake ecosystem. However, if those excess nutrients are kind of fueling algal blooms unchecked by other things that absorb nutrients in the water column, like plants, you can see these things called algae blooms, which cause water quality impairments. And those algae blooms could either cause nuisance levels like smells and aesthetic problems. But in this case, as you can see in the picture on the left, this is a picture of a cyanobacteria bloom. Cyanobacteria are a type of algae that can rapidly take over the surface of lakes in the warm summer months, and they can bloom into these large accumulations and actually can produce toxins under some conditions. Under a healthy system, as you can see down here, we have different types of algae, which we would want to see kind of slowly progress through their different niches throughout the season. Diatoms and green algae are these more benign and kind of staple food sources for zooplankton. So we would like to see those kind of grow and proliferate just as much as the blue-green algae. And diatoms usually prefer colder times, so they're going to be seen in the spring and fall. Green algae starts to come up in the early summer and kind of persist through the summer, and then blue-green algae really prefers that really hot, stagnant part of the summer. And that's kind of when we would see these cyanobacteria blooms if the conditions were right. Another thing to consider about algae is that although they are photosynthetic, they produce oxygen during the daytime, but then at night when they respire, they actually locally consume oxygen. So that could cause overnight fish kills. And then also the decay of those algae blooms can also consume a lot of oxygen and cause dead zones or low oxygen spots that could affect fisheries. Next thing I'm going to talk about are macrophytes, or aquatic plants, or colloquially termed weeds, which I'm not a big fan of that term as a limnologist, but aquatic plants are a nursery to fish, a refuge for those zooplankton, as I talked about, kind of that second rung of the food chain. They provide protection from shoreline erosion. They utilize that phosphorus and decrease those algae levels, kind of acting as a living sponge, and absorbing a lot more of those nutrients in a more controlled way. However, they can become a nuisance, and there are types of invasive plants that we want to avoid, or help kind of keep under control in our Minnesota systems to promote a healthy plant community for all of the different constituents of the water column. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about lake ecosystems on a whole. They're kind of what we term in limnology two staple states: a clear water state, which is the preferred state. It's aquatic plant dominated. Has a balanced fish community with abundant aquatic plants to keep that water clean. However, conversely, if we have kind of an imbalance in those nutrients availability, we can switch over into an algae dominated turbid state, which has kind of a less balanced fish community and too few aquatic plants, and kind of dominated by this less transparent water that has a lot of algae persistent in it. To kind of distinguish these two states, these clear water and turbid water states, we could characterize these into different trophic levels. That's a kind of a measure of lake fertility and productivity. So in the middle here is what's called mesotrophic. So that's just kind of the middle between these two states. The less productive state, kind of think about a lake in the boundary waters, or in Alaska, it's considered oligotrophic, so the cooler temperatures, more oxygen, less algae, and overall less nutrients there, as opposed to a more eutrophic system, which would have warmer temperatures, less oxygen, and excessive algae blooms. So there are three key parameters that make up these trophic states. The first is phosphorus, as I talked about, as kind of the limiting nutrient. So this is the macronutrient that we associate with this productivity, especially in freshwater systems. And then we associate different concentrations of that phosphorus to different trophic states. So that hypereutrophic being very high concentrations and oligotrophic being very low concentrations. The second one is transparency, which is basically the measure of light penetration in the water column. So light penetration, or transparency or clarity, can be affected by turbidity or different constituents of the water column that absorb light and make it so that you can't see kind of the rocks at the bottom of the water, because those constituents are absorbing that light before it can hit the bottom. So that turbidity could either be made out of sediments that have washed in maybe after a rainstorm, or algal turbidity. So those are those free-floating phytoplankton that are living within the water column, kind of absorbing that light to fuel their photosynthetic metabolism and absorbing those nutrients as they come in and kind of soaking that up, but also not allowing light to penetrate down to the sediments, which really decreases the ability for plants to receive that light and start growing to fuel their own metabolisms. And so we do have deeper transparency associated with that oligotrophic kind of clear water state, and then shallower transparency is associated with the hypereutrophic states. And then the last one is chlorophyll, which is the measure of the algae in themselves. So chlorophyll is the pigment, the green pigment that all photosynthetic organisms have that allow them to fuel their metabolism by absorbing light and then fueling their entire metabolism. So the measure of chlorophyll is directly related to how much algae or photosynthetic material is in the water column itself. And so obviously, just like phosphorus, the lower the concentration of chlorophyll, kind of the less productive, more clear water state that we're in the oligotrophic zone versus higher concentrations put us in the hypereutrophic and eutrophic zone. And then we could break that down all into this spectrum of different trophic state indices, which I'm going to talk about with each of the lakes here. And the state statistically looks at kind of where lakes of these sizes and depths are expected to be and considered healthy. So we'll look at how those numbers shape up for these. And spoiler alert, it's good news for both of these lakes this afternoon. The first lake I'm going to talk about is Masterman Lake. It's a lake of 40 acres with a maximum depth of 7 feet, which is quite shallow for lakes in Minnesota. And that also means that it has 100% littoral area. So when we talk about littoral area, that is the portion of the lake that is less than 15 feet deep and kind of dominated for vegetation. So this is the area of the lake that is suitable for vegetation to grow, where light can penetrate the sediments and kind of create that habitat for that aquatic vegetation. And then water levels, we'll talk, Ryan will talk a little bit about in the flood risk part of the talk. So this is the watershed of Masterman Lake. It's primarily forested. This is a map that shows the different parts of the watershed and what their land use looks like. So those blue areas are our water, our reds and pinks and browns are our developed land. The greens are the forests and grasslands. The yellow is the pasture with some browns being the cultivated crops. And so you can see that there's a lot of a forested section and then also some pasture land up in the north and northwest part of the watershed. I'm going to talk a little bit about aquatic plants on Masterman Lake. So Masterman Lake contains native species like coontail and common waterweed. It's generally dominated by these species, which is really good. There was one invasive species that was observed during the surveys, which was raised water milfoil. However, those were not in large concentrations. It's primarily dominated by native species, which is great. And then the fisheries data, which was done in the 90s, resulted in a healthy fish population with several different size classes of predatory fish, and then a robust population of black bullheads. And also some turtles were found during that survey. So that's kind of nice to note as well. So both of these aquatic life surveys show a healthy population, especially for a shallow lake like Masterman Lake. Then we're going to talk about shoreline. As Brett's going to point out, shoreline is a really important part of lake health. That is, it promotes habitat for those nearshore organisms and also prevents harmful erosion that contribute to that turbidity and nutrient sources into the water column. The majority of the shoreline is natural, so that's characterized by that blue outline there. A natural shoreline is categorized by dense tree canopy, a very low percentage of manicured lawn, and then a low percentage of impervious area. So that would be areas that don't allow for any infiltration and only kind of running off water that comes into contact with it into the lake itself without any kind of pre-treatment. There are some areas that have opportunity for landowners to improve, and that's characterized kind of by these yellow and red, which kind of show a higher percentage of manicured lawns or impervious area and kind of that less tree canopy. So Brett's going to talk a little bit more about opportunities to improve those priority areas. And then I'm just going to end Masterman Lake discussion with talking about its current water quality status. So as of 2023, it received a B grade. And as you can see kind of from these trophic states, it's kind of in this turquoise zone, and all of its parameters, transparency, chlorophyll, and photos and total phosphorus, which is in that mesotrophic area, and also its trophic state indices are kind of in within that expected range for this type of lake. So that's really good, a really good sign. Overall, it's suitable for swimming and wading with good clarity and low algae levels throughout the open water season. The next lake I'm going to talk about is Woodpile Lake. It's a 15-acre lake, maximum depth of 27 feet, and 8% littoral zone. So this lake is a little bit deeper. It has less littoral area because of that depth, so less opportunity maybe for those plants to dominate as much percentage of the lake, unlike Masterman Lake. And this is Woodpile's watershed breakdown. The watershed is heavily agricultural and forested with very little development. So the scale is the same as before, with those reds kind of being those developments and those greens and yellows being the agriculture and woodland. And so we can see quite a lot of forest and agriculture in this watershed. Woodpile Lake has generally dominated by native species, cattails, pondweeds. There was one invasive species that was observed during this survey back in 2009. So we did look at what that looks like. So that's called curly leaf pondweed. Curly leaf pondweed has a very significant and predictable life cycle. So it kind of blooms in this early spring and then it dies off, or what we call senesces. And then so we wanted to look at like how that changed over time after that senescence. We kind of saw after the curly leaf had left that these other native some of these other native species came up, but then there was also some algae that came up after it. The fisheries data has a very simple community structure, kind of dominated by panfish, bluegill, crappie, sunfish, and some northern pike were also present. Woodpile Lake, the majority of the shoreline is moderate or natural, but there are some opportunities for landowners to improve those priority areas, especially kind of across the north side there by some suggestions that Brett is going to make. And overall, Woodpile Lake is receiving a grade A. It's in this mesotrophic state. It has good clarity, and it is its trophic state is within the expected range for lakes in its region. So that's good news. We're going to hand it over to Ryan now.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to pull up my slides here to share. And just checking that everybody can see my slides and hear me all right.
Yep, perfect.
Thanks. So in reviewing flood risk around Browns Creek, I'll begin by briefly explaining what we're talking about when we use the term the 100-year storm or 100-year flood, because it is a bit misleading. It is statistically a storm depth that, based on the historical record of precipitation, has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And that is to say it can happen more frequently than once in 100 years. In fact, there is a 1 in 4 chance of this happening during a 30-year mortgage period. In Browns Creek, that storm depth is 7.2 inches, occurring in 24 hours for most lakes and ponds, such as Lake Masterman that has an outlet. And however, with ponds or lakes like Woodpile that do not have an outlet structure and do not reach an overflow elevation frequently, we look at a little bit more conservative event where we consider frozen ground conditions and we use that same 7.2 inches of precipitation. And what happens there is we get a lot more volume running off the landscape because the water cannot soak into the soil with frozen ground. The background on why we started to look more closely at this is that we saw unprecedented precipitation happening in 2019 and 2020. We also saw groundwater levels coming up in that period. The images here show the recorded water levels, and those were on the rise with Woodpile, Masterman. I've got another example, the Kimbrough Basin. We also saw flooding during these years. Flooding over the County Road 12 by Kimbrough Basin. Kimbrough Avenue was inundated. Lake Elmo Avenue also saw flooding. We were hearing reports of driveways being overflowed as well as their culverts blowing out. And we did have one report of a house being flooded. One other change in the past decade or so is that we have a new 100-year rainfall event. I mentioned that 7.2 inches being the 100-year event. Prior to 2014, we believed that to be 5.9 inches. However, NOAA came out with a new study looking at more recent precipitation, and statistically it became 7.2 inches. So if you can imagine, a lot of the lots around the lakes and ponds and wetlands around Browns Creek have been developed assuming a smaller amount of rainfall being that 1% chance statistical event. With this new information, we revised the Browns Creek computer model to determine what the water level response would be to this higher amount of rainfall. We also considered that we were looking at higher water levels throughout the district. So we took those higher water levels as the starting elevation for our simulations. Being that looking through the records of the water levels, we saw that this wasn't the only time that some of these lakes had experienced high water. In fact, Woodpile reached its highest, just slightly higher in 1996, slightly higher than it did in 2020. Now I'll provide a brief history on what's been done in the past. You may have heard about FEMA and the FEMA floodplain. The map that you see on the screen here is the FEMA floodplain. I'm using Bass Lake as an example. So the cyan dotted line or dotted area and the line depicts where that FEMA floodplain is for this water body. It is a situation where you're either in it or you're out of it. If you are in it and you have a federally backed mortgage, you are required to get flood insurance. If you're out of it, you are not. These polygons, the areas over the water bodies, were based on studies done in 2004, based on the information that we had on hand at that time, which was less resolution in our topography information, less information on the precipitation, as well as less information on water levels. I will note that this flood risk analysis that Browns Creek has gone through more recently here is not remapping of the FEMA floodplain boundaries and does not have any impact on whether you do or do not need flood insurance. This is really just a local study to help us understand and the residents of Browns Creek understand flood risk. With this newer study, we use more modern topographic information. The information that's available now is actually accurate to within about 1 foot in elevation. And what you see on the screen here are highlighted a number of magenta polygons that shows us the storage areas within a lot of the landscape around these wetlands and lake basins. We also took into consideration the flood footprint on individual properties. Advancing my slides here more, you can see that the roads are highlighted, the buildings are highlighted. There are some pink X's on there depicting wells. We took into consideration where those were located, as well as yellow dots being the septic information. This is all information that's available through the county. It is not always 100% accurate, and I'll have a note on that a little bit later in the slides. But with that information, we're able to estimate the elevation of these buildings, the elevation of the wells, and we can see how much inundation might happen over the building, the well, or the septic based on the flood footprint. As I mentioned, we included the wells and the septics, and that is because not only can flood damage homes and damage properties, if drinking water wells get inundated, there can be health and safety concerns. It can introduce pathogens and contaminants getting into the drinking water. There are short-term solutions such as boiling your water. Once the water subsides, you'd want to have your well disinfected and have a pump test completed. Septic systems getting inundated can cause the system to back up, which could cause internal damage to the home. Also, high groundwater table can impact septic systems by mixing in with it and getting groundwater contamination. Moving into the results, we are estimating that Lake Masterman has a high water level for that 100-year event of a 958.29. Now that is shown on this map as the blue semi-transparent polygon around the lake. You'll note that there is a red dotted line around that. That's just an offset buffer of about 15 feet where we like to take into consideration inaccuracies in our mapping, inaccuracies in our computer modeling, just so that we can flag anything within a closer proximity of the flood footprint, as being a potentially higher risk. For the case of Lake Masterman, we are predicting that one road is flooded, Delwood Avenue. That is flooded by about 1.6 feet of depth, which is impassable by typical vehicles. It is not recommended to drive through water greater than 6 inches in depth for a typical vehicle. If you get to 1 foot of depth, you can experience flotation, which could move the vehicle off the road. We did not find any buildings or wells or septics that were at risk. However, on this map, you'll note that the blue and white dots are our estimate of where the wells are located. The stars are estimates for septic locations. We are lacking quite a bit of data on this. We do not have data for 14 of 15 parcels surrounding the lake. So that is where we are asking for some assistance. Following these presentations, we will be sending out mailers with maps of each individual property, asking for those property owners to markate where the well and septic is on their property, and then send that back to the district in a stamped envelope that will be provided. Moving on to Woodpile Lake, we're estimating the high water level to be a 972.5. With that elevation, one road is estimated to be flooded, and that is 83rd Street. You can see on this map to a depth of approximately 2.5 feet. Again, that would be impassable by most vehicles. We're also predicting that 5 buildings would either be inundated by the 100-year flood footprint or within the 15-foot buffer that I mentioned. Those buildings are outlined in yellow on this map. I do have some zoomed in images of these coming up. We also considered flood impacts on the wetlands to the northwest of Woodpile, and that is because these water bodies nearly connect for this large rain event. And so we believe there to be some interaction there and wanted to flag any risks. Zooming into one of those wetlands, you can see the blue polygon over the wetland here. And we have flagged one building to be at risk that is within the flood footprint, the blue polygon, and it's not just at that 15-foot buffer, but it is predicted to get wet. And further to the east on Woodpile Lake, here's a yellow building outlined that is within that 15-foot buffer that I mentioned. So therefore, we consider that to be potentially be at risk in this case. And further to the east, we have one building that is predicted to be inundated and two buildings that are within that 15-foot flood footprint or buffer around the flood footprint. Here's some information on what you can do and when to take action. On these two water bodies, we're predicting that the 100-year event will increase the water level between 2 and 4 feet, depending on the watershed. So that would be about 2 feet of rise for Lake Masterman before it spills over to the road, and about 4 feet for Woodpile Lake. The water level drawdown from that event happening really varies depending on whether there's the outlet. So it's going to draw down much more quickly for Masterman Lake and slowly for Woodpile as it soaks into the ground and is evaporated. The greater vertical distance from the water is certainly better. We call that building freeboard. Couple guidelines here. Desired for Woodpile would be about 6 feet. If at any time the water level is closer than 6 feet to your building, we would consider that to be at an elevated risk level because the water could come up 4 feet from the 100-year event. For Masterman Lake, a guideline would be 4 feet because that one only bounces about 2 feet. Within those distances, that should allow 2 feet of freeboard, which is desirable. Pardon me, I'm going to back up one slide. If the water level is greater than your comfort level in a given year, you could consider enacting a flood action plan for your property. This involves identifying the low areas that would flood, areas that would be prone to erosion if it does flood, planning protection measures for infrastructure such as wells, buildings, to prevent water intrusion. And it is a good thing to estimate the amount of time it could take to implement a plan because some projects have a much longer lead time, some projects that don't take quite as long to implement. I've listed here some low-tech flood mitigation strategies. One of them being just runoff and snow and ice management, making sure that you are directing and storing it away from your structures so that it doesn't cause water to back up against the structure. Making sure that conveyances like gutters, ditches, and culverts are clean so that they can convey the water when an event happens. Simple landscaping to make sure that you have positive slope away from structures can help. Adding a secondary power source to a sump pump so that if the power goes out, you can still move water away from foundations. Exterior French drains are also helpful. Applying waterproof sealants or membranes against foundations if your building is at risk of becoming inundated, that can help protect the inside. Sandbag barriers you may be familiar with. It's a temporary solution, but they are effective. And then also purchasing flood insurance. Again, I'll just note that this flood risk analysis is not remapping of FEMA floodplain boundaries. It does not have an impact on your insurance, but this is just for informational purposes at this time. I have up here one example project that was done in 2022 in Browns Creek. This is over on Long Lake and Stillwater, in which the homeowner reinforced their foundation. They put some core fill in their foundation. They waterproofed their foundation to a certain level. They also installed a sanitary backflow preventer because they are on the city sanitary system. Down in the lower picture, you can see they installed their walkout door. They've installed a flood protection box around it with a removable gate. They also installed some sump pumps, auxiliary sump pumps to move water away from the foundation. They incorporated some landscaping to make it all look much better than these photos during construction look. And we believe that they have protection up to the 200-year event with their improvements here. Here are a couple notes on what Browns Creek can do. We're working with the local government. Browns Creek regulates through their permitting program new and redevelopment in the district, and that is to adhere to stormwater runoff standards such as how fast the water comes off the land, how much volume leaves the land, as well as the quality of the water leaving the land. We are also actively monitoring water bodies and precipitation throughout the district so that we can flag areas where water levels are increasing fast, or where we predict that to happen due to a lot of precipitation. Another thing that we're doing is knowledge sharing, such as what we're doing today in talking to the community on the current state of the science for flood response planning, linking residents with available guidance and information as well. This slide includes live links to a number of those resources that residents can use. When this is posted up on Browns Creek's website, you can click on these and get more information for flood inundation, flood planning for your particular situation. And I do end these saying that low risk doesn't mean no risk, just that everybody is in a floodplain, and it's a matter of what event we're talking about. You can see listed here for Browns Creek, the events from 1 year up to the 1,000-year event range from 2.4 inches all the way up to 11.4 inches. And 11.4 inches, I believe, has happened across Minnesota at times. So it can happen here too.
Thanks, Ryan. All right. Well, hi, my name's Brett Stolpelstead. I'm with the Washington Conservation District. We're the soil and water conservation districts for the county. And every year we offer free on-site consultation to Washington County residents. And we work closely with Browns Creek Watershed District to help implement their programs throughout the district, including their stewardship grant program. And so I'm just going to take a few minutes to highlight a few best management practices, or BMPs, that you can think about and implement on your property to help protect water quality and enhance habitat in your area. And at the end, if any of this sparks interest or curiosity, I have some links that you can click on to go and learn more, or go visit our website and sign up for a site visit. We'd be happy to meet with you in the spring or in the future. So Anne alluded to this earlier in the presentation, but I just thought I'd start by highlighting the importance of preserving, maintaining, or restoring natural shoreline on your property. It's important for a variety of reasons. Maybe first and foremost is erosion prevention. A lot of our native species here in Minnesota, grasses, sedges, wildflowers, trees, and shrubs have deep, dense, fibrous root systems that do a really great job of holding the shoreline in place, those soil particles in place, making it more resistant and resilient to erosion from wave action, ice action, etc. And likewise, that dense above ground biomass and vegetation can be a really effective way of filtering pollutants from upland sources, including excess nutrients that might come from grass clippings, areas of erosion, things of that nature. So kind of that twofold benefit of restoring and maintaining natural vegetation, native vegetation on your shoreline, and also really great way to enhance and incorporate habitat for wildlife, and particularly preserving that lateral connection between aquatic and terrestrial upland habitats. And I think that graphic in the bottom left, it does a really great job kind of showing that diagrammatically, that transition from aquatic habitats up to upland terrestrial, and eventually to your turf areas that you are managing as well. And there's a blow up of that on the next slide, I believe. There's a blow up of that, just showing how that you can think about each of those areas in distinct zones. And we, part of what we can do is help you think about each of those zones and the plant species that fit within each of those zones. So if you have areas of erosion that you're hoping to address and mitigate, or if there's areas of your shoreline that you're looking to enhance, we can help you identify the plant species that fit within that gradient of transition. And along with that, a good proportion of the shoreline on these lakes are wooded, and so it's likely common to see tipped and fallen branches and logs and other sources of woody debris that are overhanging or have fallen into the water itself, and that's really great for the same reasons that I just mentioned, for erosion prevention, but also for habitat creation. So not necessarily something that you need to worry about cleaning up. If you do see that fallen woody debris, it could be something that you actually would like to enhance or promote. And so you could go so far as to tether existing fallen logs and trees to the shoreline with tethers and duckbill anchors, things of that nature, just to help affix them in place, and so they don't become a nuisance for your neighbor. But I think preserving that habitat is also really important. Okay, moving up slope a little bit. Your lawn maintenance practices are also really important for protecting water quality for variety of reasons. I guess, namely, first and foremost, would be just making sure that the root systems of your turf is healthy enough to hold and enhance the capacity of the soil to retain stormwater and nutrients, and so that those excess nutrients in that volume isn't running off of your lawn straight into the adjacent water body. And so there's a number of things you can do to promote turf health, including mowing to a slightly higher height than you may or may not be used to, so 3 inches at the minimum, making sure that you're not removing more than 1/3 of that turf height at any given mowing time. So mowing more consistently to remove less than 1/3 of the turf at any given time, making sure that you're using sharp mower blades to reduce the susceptibility to pests and diseases, alternating your mowing pattern, and also leaving your grass clippings on site. It could be the equivalent of up to 1 fertilizer application per year. And so a really great way to reduce the overall inputs that you need to add to your lawn to promote a healthy, resilient turf. Next slide. Rain gardens, another stormwater best management practice that you may be familiar with. It is essentially a small depression in the landscape designed to collect and treat stormwater runoff and reduce pollution to lakes, rivers, and streams. And essentially, it's a shallow depression with a flat bottom designed to capture and collect stormwater and infiltrate it, filtering out those pollutants and reducing the volume of stormwater that leaves your site. And you can also plant these with a native vegetation, again, to provide habitat for pollinators, birds, and other wildlife. It can be a really great aesthetic enhancement to your landscape, which is one of the reasons why I really love this picture to the right. I think just a really great example of how this rain garden, which is off to the left, you can kind of see the inlet from a adjacent driveway in the bottom left-hand corner of the photo, but just blends in really nicely and seamlessly with the surrounding landscape of this particular home. And so this is another practice that we can help you with in designing and implementing as well. And in the same vein, as to rain gardens, infiltration trenches or French drains, another infiltration practice that has many of the same water quality benefits as rain gardens in terms of temporary storage and infiltration of stormwater, removing pollutants, but in a smaller footprint. And so they're essentially a shallow excavated trench backfilled with coarse aggregate with a permeable liner between the native soils and the aggregate. But another great practice to consider where space may be limited. and you're working with relatively small drainage areas or small areas of impervious surfaces, like next to a driveway or a garage, for example, as in this photo and diagram here. Slide. And we are getting into winter here. We had some snow yesterday. I think we have some more snow on the way later this week, and with temperatures dropping pretty dramatically, I think, today and tomorrow. So just wanted to take a couple moments to highlight ways that you can think about reducing your use of salt or chloride on the landscape. And just as a reminder that it takes just 1 teaspoon of salt to permanently pollute 5 gallons of water. And so it's really important to think about, how you're utilizing chloride products or salt on your landscape. And starting with salting, it's just over off to the right there, that graphic, I think sums it up nicely. Just making sure that you're shoveling before you apply salt. Try not to over apply. You only need 12 ounces per 1,000 square feet of salt to melt ice and keep that area clear and safe. It becomes ineffective when temperatures fall below 15 degrees. And so you're better off choosing an alternative product like sand or grit as opposed to salt. And when the snow and the ice has been melted and the pavement is clear and you see granules there on the pavement, it's also important. You can go ahead and sweep that up and reuse it for another application later on. So the combination of those 4 things can help you reduce the amount of salt that you're applying to impervious surfaces on the landscape, which helps protect water quality and preventing chloride pollution. So just wanted to highlight those few quick strategies there. And I included some links at the very end to really great list of articles on the MPCA website that you can go and learn a little bit more about those smart salting practices. Just wanted to highlight, another potential source of chloride pollution that, maybe goes overlooked more often than salt use, but for streets and pavements, but your water softeners. There's a good chance that here in our part of the state, where most of us get our water from well sources, there's a good chance that you're contending with hard water. So water with a calcium carbonate concentration of over 120 milligrams per liter or so. And you may or may not have a water softener in your home. And if you don't, it may come down to personal preference whether you decide it's a necessary appliance to add to your home for maintenance of certain appliances in your plumbing, for example. But if you do have a water softener, or if you're thinking about getting one, there are some things that you can take into consideration just to make sure that you're preventing or reducing chloride pollution to drinking water sources and nearby water bodies. Typically the softened water goes to your tap and the brine solution goes down the drain. You can install a bypass system for your water softener to make sure that the softened water it's not being used for irrigation. You can consider non-salt based systems like a reverse osmosis, for example, and you can switch from a timer-based system to a demand-based system to help reduce the amount of salt that you're picking up at the hardware store for your water softener. So just wanted to highlight a few things there, and you might be able to get a little bit more information on the hardness of your water through your local municipality. And if that information isn't available, we can help connect you to resources nearby to help you get a little bit more information about the water that you're using. And here are a few of those links I mentioned available through U of M Extension and MPCA on smart salting and chloride reduction practices. a few additional slides on turf maintenance, healthy turf maintenance practices, and turf alternatives through U of M Extension. Really great, thorough information here. So I definitely encourage you to go check out these U of M Extension links. And lastly, if you are curious and would like to work with us on shoreline restoration or enhancement, and it also have questions about, what the DNR recommends in their permitting processes. There's a few links on this slide to help you gather a little bit more information on the permitting process. And this is something that we can help you with as well. And lastly, I mentioned that site visit sign up form. There's a link to that in the top left. You can learn a little bit more about the district's stewardship grant program on the link below that. And if you are interested in working with us in designing and implementing BMP for your property, we can help you design that, come up with a cost estimate, identify contractors, and connect you to those funding sources. So go check out those two links, and then my contact information is below that. All right.
Thank you very much, everybody. With the last few minutes that we have, we had a couple of residents that were joining us here today. Any questions or thoughts or comments you'd like to share? Or is there anything that we didn't include today that you would like to hear more about in the future? We'd love to hear that.
This is Steve Levon. I appreciated the presentation, learned a lot. A couple of questions. I noticed in some of the slides that Ann showed, one in particular where she was showing the area that comprised the watershed for the area, particularly around Masterman Lake. There was the map, at least from what I could tell, didn't show any cultivated cropland to the west. And there's a lot of cultivated cropland directly to the west. I'm not sure why that is. I just don't know how much of that fertilizer or whatever inputs they're using there end up in Masterman Lake. Also, where Highway 96 goes underneath the Gateway Trail there. I don't think there's anything capturing any of the road salt that's coming off the road there. It just kind of sits in that parking lot, ends up in Masterman Lake. I suspect that those two things are probably some sources for unwanted chemical going into the lake.
Is this what you were referring to?
Yeah. And on the west side of the lake there, Costa Vegetable Farm has got quite a few acres there that are all cultivated crops.
Looks like the land cover mapping that we were pulling this from is recognizing that as pasture or hay at the time that this was done. So maybe there's just some updates that need to happen there.
Yeah, thank you.
And your point is well taken. That is absolutely something we need to be thinking about and concerned about and a potential source of those nutrients getting to the lake. Absolutely.
And I don't know if there's I don't know whose responsibility it is to try to capture stormwater runoff off of a state highway, and how do you treat that before it ends up in our lakes and our streams. But clearly 96 there's no gutters along that area. There's nothing really to capture that runoff. And in the wintertime, I know it's going right into the lake.
My understanding
but-
is actually 96 was turned over to Washington County recently as well. So
Okay.
typically speaking, many of these roads were built without any stormwater management in place when they came in. And as there is redevelopment of those roads or reconstruction down to the natural materials, there's actually a permitting requirement to actually retrofit those at that time. We have so many roads in our system at this point. retrofitting those all simultaneously, instantaneously is pretty cost prohibitive. But,
Right.
for instance, County Road 5, the county has that's going over Browns Creek is being reconstructed right now. So there's stormwater management that's being implemented as a part of that. And that same sort of exercise will happen, whether that's MnDOT, as the state, or whether or not that's the county road or a city road, as those roads are retrofitted. There are opportunities sometimes if we do identify that there's a localized problem area, we can look for opportunities that are voluntary, projects. Overall, given the sort of wooded nature of Masterman Lake, it's actually one of the highest quality water bodies we have in Browns Creek watershed area. It's doing quite well. We need to make sure it's not gonna, start going in reverse, but it actually is doing quite well. We have seen some changes though over just even the last decade of a little bit more of the shoreline, direct shoreline has been altered in the last decade or so. So, that's something that we would definitely, kind of wanting to be watched how the lake is responding to that. But we are still seeing an improving trend in Masterman. So that, that's the good news here. But we're always looking for more opportunities and things like you're saying, chlorides. None of these stormwater features are going to take out chlorides. And so, the state is definitely interested and the county is interested in, the chloride impairments. We've started monitoring for chlorides on Masterman Lake a couple of years ago. So at least we've got some good baseline data. It's a tricky situation when, our county, our road authorities are trying to balance water quality with public safety. So.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us today. Any other thoughts or questions? Do you live on Masterman Lake directly?
I do. I live on the west side. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have any other comments or questions, but I appreciate your time and it was very informative.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming in. We will be recording this. Also, if you have any other neighbors that are interested, tomorrow evening, we are going to be meeting at the Stillwater Library, an in-person meeting that will be sharing some of the same information, have a few treats, and some opportunity just for some one-on-one conversations as well. So if you know of anybody who would have liked to have joined us, we will also have this recording available on our website as well. So we'll be sending out some information to folks, trying to gather up a little bit more of the information regarding some of the flood risk, wells and whatnot. We'll also be sharing where to be able to find this recording as well.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest
you.
of your day.
Thank you.
You.